Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Great to be here. Yes, I'm talking about blockchain. What I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about blockchain in transportation towards the end, what I've seen and what I know about it so far. But what I really want to do, first of all, though, is kind of describe or clarify some of the language that goes on in this space. Because I think until we kind of get to some sort of understanding of the words that a lot of folks are using to describe this technology, it gets really, you kind of got to understand the words before you can get going. Just a bit about me, as Alan mentioned, I have been working with the Central Ohio Transit Authority in Ohio for a few years now. I actually got into that through blockchain. I've been in the crypto and blockchain space since about 2014 or so. So prior to kind of the big run up and bubble that's happened over the past couple of years. Before that, much of my background is in product development work, data strategy, done a lot of building of products on top of large data sets. At the end of the day, when you look at kind of the pattern of where I've found myself most interested, it's in spaces that are being disrupted. And I think transit is definitely in the early stages of what I think will be a pretty radical disruption over the coming years, similar to kind of what happened in music 20 or so years ago, what happened to journalism and retail and so forth. In addition, just a plug here as well about a cybersecurity report I helped write with Scott Belcher. He spoke about it yesterday. It was just published this week. On cybersecurity in transit. So just wanted to plug that as well. But let's get into blockchain. So again, what I want to get into is kind of talk about what it is and also why it's so complex. It is a hard thing to understand. It has taken me years really of research and conversations and reading and so forth to get to where I am. So I guess my point is be ready if you choose to get on the rabbit hole. And then we will get into the practical applications that I'm seeing right now, and then the impact on security in transport. So at the end of the day, just as a precursor here, I'm going to talk about Bitcoin specifically. So Bitcoin is a protocol it's kind of the father, if you will, of blockchain as a technology. It started about 11 years ago, and it's kind of the largest, most premier sort of blockchain program that exists today. So I'm going to use that as kind of a description to then talk also about blockchain. So Bitcoin is in effect a ledger of accounts, kind of like a bank. The interesting thing, though, is that there is no central authority determining who can and cannot participate. Really, anyone can participate in the system however they wish. And there are a number of different roles you can play. You may have heard things like miner, Bitcoin mining. There are Bitcoin operators that manage some of the system. And then, of course, users, both on sort of the buyer and seller side. And at the end of the day, what you need to know is when someone says they have Bitcoin, all that means is they have the keys, if you will, to an account on this ledger that exists. That ledger, though, is in fact what what blockchain is. So the blockchain is the ledger of accounts that manages who owns what at any point in time. And this chain of accounts is managed by a community. There's no one authority that can determine what can and cannot go into those any changes to those accounts. The changes happen in the open through the system under the rules that govern the system. And that's what's been pretty amazing is that, again, there is no central authority determining the rules. It's the system itself. All of the rules are in the code. And so anyone can look at the code, if you can get to that level of technical sophistication, to understand the rules in a very transparent way. And these accounts, again, we talk about Bitcoin, but these accounts could be anything from any type of data. And both electronic data, and then a lot of folks are trying to have these electronic accounts, these digital accounts represent something physical, whether it be a home or a supply chain, transportation, or some things of that sort. So blockchain technology can be these other things. It doesn't mean it always is. And I think that's a big thing that's missed, especially with some of the rhetoric that I'm sure you're hearing from some of the vendors out there. If you are getting into this space, blockchain doesn't always mean these characteristics aren't always associated with it. The first is the decentralized idea. That's the idea that there's no centralized infrastructure. I mentioned Bitcoin does have that characteristic, but there are many other blockchain projects out there that some even claim to have decentralized infrastructure, but are not, in fact, at all centralized. And if you want to get more technical, I can even get into how Bitcoin is actually not decentralized in some aspects, but that's a much deeper conversation over beers. The other bit is around permissionless. So one of the grand sort of ideological ideas around Bitcoin is that anyone can participate. I mentioned that earlier. All you need is an internet connection. There's no authentication process. There's no validation. There's no central authority saying who can and cannot get into that system. Not every blockchain technology has that capability. And in fact, most, especially when you're talking about real world applications, haven't gone that far to get into the permissionless characteristic. Personally, I think that that's where the biggest opportunity is, especially when you look at some of the transportation use cases, in particular around mobility, in particular around supply chain, where if you can build a system where the rules are embedded in the code and you can kind of let it go and let it flourish, that will have a tremendous, there's an opportunity for that to really change the game and how a particular system might operate. And then the last thing, again, given the theme of this conference, security. That's the one that I always shake my head at, where a lot of vendors out there and a lot of sort of the speakers on this front talk about blockchain as being secure. The actual reality of the security of blockchain is that it's different. It's not necessarily more secure or less secure. It can pretty dramatically in some instances and in some use cases change the attack surface, change how it might be corrupted. But at the end of the day, there still is the opportunity for corruption. And so going into blockchain or employing blockchain because it's quote unquote secure is going to lead to a problem. And in fact, with some of the sort of the paradigms that are introduced with blockchain, they're kind of novel. And that novel nature of some of those paradigms actually could, for a particular use case, make it less secure. And again, I can get into detail on that if you're curious. Let's see. The other bit, though, is around visibility. At the end of the day, I think what is really powerful or the potential sort of in the short term is using blockchain to provide visibility and transparency to the activity of a system. And so it's not just merely sort of open sourcing or creating open access to the logs. There's a lot more behind that can be done, again, to build trust and further develop support behind a particular system. So just to get into some myths here, again, there's a lot of nuance around these words that are used to describe Bitcoin and blockchain more general. And it really takes a lot of time and effort to understand this nuance. And when you're looking at applying this technology, it kind of gets important to get under the covers a bit to really figure out that nuance. Again, to make sure that you're not going down a path that isn't either necessary for the use case that you're trying to use it for, and also doesn't open you up to unforeseen risk. I mentioned the decentralized thing. I guess I'll go into it a little bit. With Bitcoin, yes, anybody can participate. The one area where there is centralization is around the code management. So the code is available and anyone can see it. And anyone can actually offer up a change to the code, an improvement, a feature, and there's a bunch of process behind that. But there's actually only, I believe right now, it's 6 or 8 individuals who have the explicit privileges within the code repository to determine what code can be accepted and what cannot. And so there is invariably a point of centralization because of those individuals. And now there's all sorts of process around it. There's a whole sort of schema of how things get done, decisions get made, and so forth that try and allay that sort of ownership off the shoulders of those individuals. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that have the keys. Let's see if I can pick another one. Let's see, immutability, that's another one. Nobody can change a blockchain. That's in fact true in the sense that they can't change what the blockchain says, what the Bitcoin blockchain says, but it doesn't mean that you can't have a perfectly correct transaction happen, but that transaction in fact can't be that transaction can't be nefarious through other means. So for example, I have Bitcoin, and if somebody gets access to my account, they can get access to my account, produce a transaction, and then there's nothing I can do about it because they got access to my account. The other one, the anonymous one, is also a funny one. A lot of people think that Bitcoin is anonymous, and in fact, it's actually far less anonymous than certainly cash. And there's been a lot of the Treasury Department, Secret Service, and others have done a lot of work in recent years tracing and tracking folks, where it's really, really difficult to not be discovered if you're choosing to use Bitcoin for a nefarious action. So anyway, certainly if folks are curious, but to move on here, the other bit is around the complexity. And this is kind of the one that I think is missed by a lot of folks, and one that I continue to learn about and discover, despite spending so much time so far in this space. It's truly a Cambrian explosion of multiple disciplines. And so anytime you approach it from a particular vantage, you get to see some of it. But until you kind of start doing this from different vantage points, it really gets difficult to kind of see the expanse of what this stuff could become. And then you introduce sort of domain-specific knowledge, and that makes it even more complex as far as if or how this stuff might actually manifest into becoming something real. And again, I think this is the other area where a lot of the rhetoric and certainly a lot of the vendors that are trying to use this language now, they totally miss this boat. Again, they're trying to sell something digestible and concrete now, when the reality is the complexity of what this stuff could be and is prevents that from being kind of an easy thing to do. So getting into some applications here. The really big thing I think I've seen so far is using blockchain as a means to really examine your data infrastructure. So again, I mentioned I've done a lot of data-driven product development work. The evolution of what a modern data infrastructure is today has been very fast. And there's a definite delta between respective industries and how they're treating data, how they're using data. You can, everything from how the standard corporation uses data versus how a software company uses data versus, there's a delta between how enterprise organizations use, enterprise-focused organizations use data, consumer-focused organizations use data. And I think that there's always going to be an opportunity to mature your data infrastructure, and exploring blockchain technologies can certainly help you identify opportunities, either using the technology itself or just by going through the process of examining the technology, getting a better handle of what a modern data infrastructure is. I mentioned the attack surface thing. Again, the blockchain itself can be hard to attack. The cryptography for many of the protocols out there really can elevate the security of the data itself. However, mechanisms to get data changed on the blockchain, those are different. One big thing that's happened, certainly on the consumer side, is the fact that most of the blockchains out there leverage public-private key cryptography. And if you don't know what that is, a public key is a string of characters that can identify you or identify the account. But then there's a secret private key that is also required in order to make changes to that account. You have to have both the public key and the private key in order to send Bitcoin out of the Bitcoin, what it's called a wallet or the Bitcoin account. And then the public key is all you need to send Bitcoin into the public account. Again, that sounds very complex, and it is. And it also, the human brain goes to login and password, where you think the public key being the login and the password being private key. The flaw in that logic is the fact that in login and password, you always have that forgot password button that you can click if you lose access to that key. In cryptography, that don't work. You lose access to that private key, you lose control of that account, and there's nothing that can be done to recover it. And there's actually, I don't recall what the number is, but Bitcoin is in the $100 billion worth today, and there are multiple billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin that are lost because the private keys to those various accounts have been lost, and lots of stories of that. And then the last sort of application I want to talk about is this idea of a common truth among adversaries. I think that's, again, where there's a lot of opportunity in the transportation sector. There's two particular things going on that I've observed so far that are interesting. There's a ton of stuff going on in blockchain land, even in transportation. Most of it to me is noise and bluster and bluff. The two things that I do find interesting, though, is around supply chain tracking and attestation. And so this is particularly pertinent given the Huawei China stuff and how some of the cybersecurity incidents that have been uncovered. One we talk about in the report is a BART incident where they discovered the certain, I think it was like 1,000 switches that were already installed were in fact counterfeit. And supply chain tracking basically is a way, there are some really interesting experiments and projects going on in that realm that I think are exciting and could really leverage the technology effectively. Ernst & Young is one of the leaders there in this particular space. They're doing work with a crypto Ethereum-based firm called Consensus. A lot of interesting stuff in that realm. The other realm that's interesting is around mobility activity. There's actually a live application in Columbus, Ohio called Pivot that uses Hyperledger Fabric, which is an IBM-sponsored blockchain protocol to manage the data among mobility providers within the region. And these are both public and private mobility providers. I've happened to have been involved in that in some form over the last year and a half. It's a really interesting project. It could go a lot further. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, to really go dive a lot deeper into how the crypto and blockchain sort of ideas could be implemented. But again, real opportunity there, really interesting project. Let's see. And then with regard to security and transport, again, I think I've made this point already, but just to reinforce it, beware the voodoo. It's really early. As far as like really impactful, successful blockchain projects out there, they don't exist, certainly in the transportation land yet. They're coming. I think we'll see some stuff in the next few years. But there is no sort of, you got to do this with blockchain kind of thing yet. And so anyone that tells you differently is probably a little bit too drunk on the Kool-Aid, if you will. But again, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, especially when you kind of zoom out a little bit. And this is what gets me really excited about the transportation sector writ large. It's in the midst of a disruption. The role of software, the role of data, and the importance of cybersecurity in public transit specifically, and then transportation writ large, I think is growing leaps and bounds by the day, by the week, by the month. And I think that there's going to be a ton of stuff, a ton of opportunity with that sort of growth and with that change, that chaos, if you will, where some of these ideas specifically with regard to blockchain and cryptocurrencies and tokens and so forth could be brought to bear to rethink some of these systems, rebuild them in a different way and make them more accessible, more equal, more open to both the people they touch and the people that choose to engage and operate. And so I think it's a pretty exciting time.